Far in the north, where seas crash against black rocks and the sky never fully surrenders to either day or night, there lived a warrior who had walked many paths of blood and silence. His name was Eric, and though he was known among his people as a fighter who had stood against storms and men alike, he carried within him a restlessness that the clash of iron could no longer silence. The long voyages of his youth had filled his heart with echoes of distant horizons, and as his beard grew gray at the edges, he felt a call that was not of his homeland, but of lands unseen. He set sail one morning, when the mist still clung to the fjord, leaving behind only a carved token at the hearth of his kin, for he knew his voyage would not be short. His vessel creaked against the waves, the dragon prow gazing forward as though it too longed for something hidden beyond the clouds. Days became weeks, and weeks blurred into months, the endless blue stretching until it swallowed every sense of time. Yet he did not despair, for the solitude of the ocean mirrored the silence within him, and each sunrise on the empty horizon seemed a whisper that his journey was meant to be. At last, after storms that tested his strength and nights of stars unfamiliar, he saw land rise from the sea. It was no northern coast, for the trees grew tall and bending, their leaves shaped like spears of jade. The air carried scents of flowers he had never known, sweet and sharp at once, and the mountains in the distance rose like the teeth of ancient gods. Eric dragged his boat ashore and breathed the foreign wind as if it were wine. Villagers with eyes full of surprise watched him from afar, their lives interrupted by the sudden arrival of a man wrapped in furs, his axe strapped across his back, his steps heavy yet steady. They whispered in tongues he could not grasp, but fear and curiosity need no translation, and soon they scattered, leaving only the echo of their sandals on the stone paths. Eirik walked inland, his heart quiet but alert, for he knew that in every strange land there would be those who welcomed and those who challenged. He did not seek battle, yet he did not shy away from it either. His path wound through bamboo forests that sang when the wind passed, through bridges of rope that swayed above rivers swift and clear, until at last he stood before a valley that seemed untouched by time. There, on a plateau carved by centuries of patient hands, stood a monastery that rose like a vision, its roofs curved upward like the wings of resting birds, and prayer wheels spun slowly as monks moved with calm precision. Drums echoed from within, not of war, but of rhythm guiding their breath. Eirik stood at the gate, his presence as foreign as winter snow in spring, and for a long time no one approached him. At last, a figure emerged, small in stature, yet carrying a presence vast as the mountains around them. He was robed in orange and gold, his staff lightly tapping the stone as he walked. His eyes, though narrow with age, burned with clarity, and his steps carried both weight and lightness. Eirik recognized him not as a soldier, but as one who commanded through discipline, patience, and something deeper than steel. This was Master Shifu, guardian of the Jade Palace, though Eirik knew not his name. Their gazes locked, the silence of worlds between them stretching thin like ice. Shifu studied the stranger, seeing the weathered scars on his hands, the calluses of years wielding weapons, the storm of battles carried in his stance. Eirik in turn studied the master, small and unthreatening to the eye, yet radiating a power that stirred the hairs on his neck. For a long while neither spoke, yet both understood that their meeting was no accident. The wind carried fallen blossoms between them, and the sound of prayer drifted down from the monastery walls. Finally, Shifu raised his staff and pointed it toward the training grounds beyond the gate. His voice was calm, yet it carried authority that could not be ignored. Though Eric could not understand the words, he understood the intent. He nodded once, his axe shifting at his side, and stepped forward. Thus began the path that would lead not merely to combat, but to the testing of wills, the clashing of two worlds, one forged by northern storms, the other shaped by discipline and the flow of inner strength. The first steps were not of violence, but of silent acknowledgement, as though both warrior and master knew that to cross blades too soon would waste the depth of what was to come. The training grounds stretched wide, stone tiles worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, each scar upon them a memory of lessons and battles, both won and lost. Red lanterns swayed lightly above, their glow soft against the pale sky. Eric followed Master Shifu into this circle of silence, his heavy boots echoing against the stone, his presence filling the space with northern weight. Shifu moved with stillness, each step so measured that it seemed as though the ground itself guided him forward. The monks watched from the shadows of the courtyard, whispering softly, their breaths hushed by the tension that lingered between the two figures. Eric rested his hand upon the haft of his axe, though he did not lift it. His heart beat slow but steady, trained to face storms without fear. Yet a new kind of storm now coiled in the air. Shifu tapped his staff once upon the stone. The sound rippled outward like a signal, yet his eyes never left the stranger. He stood with no armor, no weapon other than the staff that had long been an extension of his body. But the weight of his presence pressed upon Eric like the unseen current of a deep river. The Viking inhaled, his breath fogging faintly in the mountain air. He swung his axe free, the blade glinting with a memory of countless battles. But his stance was one of respect, not reckless fury. He was no raider here. He was a guest in foreign lands, facing not an enemy but a mystery. Shifu bent his knees slightly, shifting his balance. His movements were quiet, like the turning of seasons, yet every line of his posture promised sudden speed. The first moment of their clash did not come from anger, but from testing. Eric stepped forward, his axe sweeping low, not to kill, but to measure. Shifu leapt lightly, his body no heavier than a drifting leaf, the staff sliding against the axe with a sound like whispering bamboo. The strike diverted, the energy redirected, and Eric felt his strength meet a wall, not of stone, but of water. He pulled back, surprised but unbroken, his breath steady as he readjusted. Shifu landed gracefully, his staff already poised, eyes narrow yet calm, the faintest flicker of respect within them. Again Eric moved, this time with greater force, the muscles of his arms tightening as he swung in a wide arc meant to test the master's resolve. Shifu met him with the smallest of movements, his staff striking not against the blade, but against the motion itself, stealing momentum, bending it, casting it away like a wave upon the shore. For the first time in many years, Eric felt the weight of his strength dissolve into nothingness, as though he fought not a man, but the emptiness of the wind. The monks watching whispered louder now, some gasping, some silent, as the Vikings circled the master, searching for a path forward. He had fought men of great size, beasts of the frozen forests, warriors who roared and kings who schemed, but never had he faced one so small, so calm, who could turn storms into silence. Shifu moved again, not with aggression, but with patience, striking lightly against Eric's wrist, then against his shoulder, not to wound, but to teach. Each touch was a reminder that raw strength could be guided, that fire could be turned back upon itself. Eric grunted, more in acknowledgement than in pain, and stepped back. His chest rose and fell, his axe gleamed, but in his eyes there was no rage, only curiosity, only respect. "You are no ordinary foe," he murmured in his own tongue, though Shifu did not understand the words. Yet perhaps he felt their meaning in the stillness of the air between them. For a moment, the two warriors stood in silence again, neither rushing, both waiting. It was not the silence of exhaustion, but of contemplation, as though they each understood that their battle was not merely of body, but of soul. Then, with a suddenness that startled even the monks, Eric charged. His feet thundered upon the stone, his axe a streak of silver, his voice a deep cry that echoed against the mountains. Shifu met him, not by retreating, but by flowing inward. His staff spun, his body turning like a current that swallowed the charge, and the two forces collided in a blur of wood and steel. Sparks of energy, not flame, leapt between them as each tested the other's heart. Blow after blow fell, axe against staff, strength against precision. Yet even in this storm, there was rhythm. Shifu's strikes flowed like breath. Eric's movements hammered like drums. Together they wove a tapestry of sound and silence, steel and wood, fury and patience. The monks could no longer whisper. They simply watched, eyes wide, their breaths caught in their throats. For them it was not a duel. It was a story unfolding, one that spoke of two worlds meeting in the language of battle. As the clash reached its height, Shifu spun low, his staff sweeping against Eric's legs. The Viking stumbled, his axe cutting air, but he did not fall. He planted his foot like a tree, the strength of the north rooting him to the ground, and swung upward in a counter that forced Shifu to leap back. The staff and axe separated, the courtyard rang with silence once more. Both stood, chests rising, eyes locked. There was no hatred between them, no malice, only the undeniable recognition of equals. Shifu bowed his head slightly, his breathing calm, and Eric returned the gesture with a slow nod. Though the battle had not ended, both knew it had only just begun, and its true depth lay not in who would triumph, but in what each would learn from the other. The air within the courtyard grew heavier, as though the mountain itself leaned closer to watch. The clash of steel and wood had ended in a silence that throbbed with unspoken challenge, and though the pause stretched long, neither warrior considered turning away. For Eric, the Viking, battle was life's truest language, and this small master before him had spoken it fluently. For Shifu, combat was not an end, but a mirror of the soul, and in Eric he saw both storm and shadow, a man unbroken, yet restless. The wind stirred the banners above, scattering petals across the stone, and with that faint signal, the fight resumed. This time, there was less caution. Eric pressed forward with the full weight of his strength, the axe whistling through the air in arcs wide enough to cleave saplings. Each strike carried the memory of wars fought in frozen fields, the hammering rhythm of Viking shields upon the hulls of ships, the raw hunger of survival. Shifu did not meet force with equal force. He danced. His feet shifted with speed and precision, his staff weaving not as a weapon but as a guide, redirecting, nudging, letting Eric's power spill harmlessly into the stone. Yet each deflection cost breath, and Shifu, though masterful, felt the weight of years in his bones. Eric pressed closer, sensing the resistance, and for a moment the balance tilted. He slammed his axe down in a thunderous blow that cracked the stone beneath. Dust leapt upward, the shock of impact rattling through the courtyard. Shifu stepped aside just in time, yet the force of the strike rippled through him, testing his endurance. The monks gasped, some stepping forward, but a single lift of Shifu's hand kept them back. He would fight this battle himself. Eric's chest heaved as he circled, sweat beading beneath his furs. He was strong, yes, but his heart knew that strength alone could not fell this master. His arms ached from striking emptiness. His legs trembled slightly from the constant pursuit. Never before had he been forced into such a contest of patience, of will against will. His opponents in the north had met him with shields and rage, not with silence and calm. Shifu, meanwhile, slowed his breathing, drawing the air deep into his lungs, letting his heart steady with each exhale. He waited, always waited, until the exact moment when the Viking's fury turned into overreach. Then the staff would flick, against the wrist, against the knee, against the shoulder. Sharp reminders that openings lived within the storm. Slowly, steadily, Eric's strikes grew heavier, less precise, the fire of his fury beginning to devour itself. His beard dripped with sweat. His roar grew hoarse, yet his spirit refused surrender. "Stand and fight," he bellowed, his voice shaking the air, though he knew Shifu was already fighting, already teaching him in ways he did not yet understand. Shifu answered not with words but with motion. He slid beneath a swing, his staff striking Eric's ankle just enough to buckle it, then leapt backward before the axe could descend again. He landed lightly, his robes flowing, his eyes calm, as though the chaos around him were nothing more than a river in spring. Eric stumbled, but caught himself, planting his foot hard, his axe carving into the stone once more. His arms trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of endless effort, meeting nothing solid. Never had battle felt so much like chasing shadows. The monks who watched began to see the story within the struggle. Here was the storm of the north, vast and untamed, against the mountain stillness, patient and immovable. They murmured among themselves, sensing that this was not about victory or defeat, but about balance, about whether fury could learn peace or peace withstand fury. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Each strike, each deflection, carved new lines into the courtyard, both visible and invisible. Eric's breaths grew ragged, but behind the exhaustion flickered something unfamiliar. Doubt. Not the doubt of losing, but the doubt of purpose. What was this fight for? Why did his heart feel heavier, even as his axe still swung? Shifu saw it in his eyes, the flicker, the question, and pressed forward with precision. His staff struck not to wound, but to guide, tapping shoulder, wrist, chest, forcing the Viking to feel the weight of every wasted motion. At last, Eric staggered back, his chest heaving, his axe low at his side. Sweat ran into his eyes, blurring his vision. He blinked, shook his head, steadied himself. He had not fallen, but he had felt the edge of defeat in a way no blade had ever given him. Shifu, though breathing heavily himself, stood tall, his staff steady, his gaze unwavering. He bowed slightly, acknowledging the Viking's strength. Eric returned the gesture with a grunt, his respect wordless but real. For a long moment, Neither moved. The courtyard fell silent, except for their breath. The monks exhaled in relief, thinking perhaps the battle had ended. But Eric lifted his axe again, slower now, not with rage, but with a strange calm. His eyes no longer burned with fury, but with focus, as though he had begun to understand that this battle was not about crushing an opponent, but about meeting something greater within himself. Shifu nodded once, as if he too recognized the change. They stepped toward each other again, not as foes, but as mirrors, their struggle far from finished but transformed. The fight had become more than survival. It had become a search for truth. The mountain winds grew colder as night drew near, and the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. The fight had lasted beyond reason, beyond endurance, and yet neither warrior had surrendered. Eric, the Viking, stood with shoulders heaving, his axe heavy in his grip, but his spirit still aflame. Shifu, staff in hand, bore the quiet marks of strain, lines of fatigue around his eyes, shallow breaths hidden beneath calm. The monks who watched dared not speak. They felt they were witness to something larger than combat, a story written between two souls from worlds apart. The battle began anew, with a slower rhythm, each strike deliberate, each movement weighted with meaning. Eirik no longer fought with wild fury. He fought with focus, his axe guided not only by muscle but by an awakened clarity. Shifu, in turn, matched him with the measured flow of a river bending around stone. Their weapons met in sparks that glowed briefly in the fading light, then vanished into the dusk. As the minutes passed, the fight became less about strength and more about endurance of spirit. Shifu darted close, his staff flicking against the Viking's ribs, drawing a grunt, but not a collapse. Eric countered with a downward sweep, the axe grazing the master's robe, cutting the air with finality. For the first time, both men tasted the edge of mortality in the clash, an acknowledgement that the next mistake would not be forgiven. Eirik's vision blurred with sweat, but within his chest something shifted. He no longer felt anger. Instead, he felt awe, even reverence. This small master, who had withstood the full storm of his strength, had shown him a truth greater than bloodlust, that restraint and patience were their own form of power. Shifu, too, felt the shift. In the Viking's eyes no longer burned only rage, but something deeper, understanding, respect, and perhaps even a longing for peace. Yet the fight demanded an end. Destiny, once set in motion, does not stop until its final note is struck. The last exchange began with silence, then a sudden storm. Eric charged with a cry that shook the stones, lifting his axe high. Shifu leapt forward, his staff a streak of motion, aiming for the Viking's chest. The two collided with a sound like thunder. Axe met staff, wood splintered, steel carved through, and both warriors staggered. The monks gasped as the staff cracked, shards scattering across the ground. Shifu dropped to one knee, clutching what remained of his weapon, his breath sharp. Eric stood above him, axe raised, yet his arms trembled not from strength, but from conflict. He could strike, he could end it, but his heart rebelled. In that hesitation, Shifu surged upward, striking with the broken length of wood, landing one final blow to the Viking side. The force was not enough to kill, but it opened Eric's guard. In the same heartbeat, the Viking's axe descended, not at full strength, but still heavy, still unstoppable. It struck the master's shoulder, and the world froze. Silence filled the courtyard as both men stood, locked in the moment. Shifu's body wavered, his eyes meeting Eric's not with fear, but with calm acceptance. He whispered words too soft for others to hear, words that carried not anger, but peace. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the stone floor. Eric's axe slipped from his hand, clattering beside him. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his vision swimming with grief and exhaustion. He fell to his knees beside the fallen master, his hands trembling as they hovered, unsure whether to reach out or to withdraw. The monks rushed forward but stopped short when they saw Shifu's expression. Though his body faltered, his face carried serenity, as if the battle had never been about survival, but about teaching, about passing something sacred to his opponent. Eric bowed his head, his long hair falling across his face, and for the first time in his warrior life, tears touched his eyes. He had fought countless battles, slain countless foes, but never had he felt a wound such as this. A wound not of flesh, but of spirit. He whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking, "You were the first I could not conquer, and yet you conquered me." Shifu's breath was shallow, but he smiled faintly, his eyes half closed, his final strength spent. With his last whisper he said, "True victory lies within." And then he was still. The courtyard filled with silence that seemed eternal. The monks bowed deeply, their grief heavy, but mingled with reverence. The master had fallen not in defeat, but in fulfillment, leaving behind a lesson that would ripple through time. Eric remained kneeling, unmoving, his heart torn between sorrow and revelation. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the first stars appeared, cold and clear. The Viking finally rose, lifting his axe not in triumph, but in mourning. He placed it gently beside Shifu's body, a gesture of respect, and turned toward the gates of the monastery. He walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, until his figure faded into the shadows of the night. The monks gathered around their fallen master, chanting softly, their voices rising like a prayer to the heavens. In that song, Eric's footsteps echoed beyond the mountain, carrying with him not victory, not conquest, but the weight of wisdom earned through struggle and loss. And though the world would remember a Viking and a master who fought beneath the mountain sky, the true story was not of battle, but of transformation. The storm learning stillness, the warrior learning peace. Good night.